Hello there guys, it's Math Dominus, and today I'm going to be making a video defending the 2009 film Avatar. This movie is famous because it's the highest grossing film of all time, twice. Despite the huge success of this film, not many people really talk about it, and when they do talk about it, they don't really talk about it in a good light. After much time has passed, people have been looking back on this film and they've been very critical about it, mainly criticizing the generic plot and the forgettable characters and such. Most of the things that people have said are calling it the ripoff of Pocahontas, Dances with Wolves, Ferngully, etc. And a lot of people say that the film is overrated. There's just one problem with that statement. If the movie is overrated, why does everybody say it's overrated? You would think that if something was overrated, that would mean there's actually a fandom for this film that talks positively about this film. And yet, most people I've talked to said that the film is just overrated. So how can a film be overrated if everybody is saying that it's overrated? It just makes no sense. But I digress. A lot of people are just really critical over this film, calling it overrated and such, but I really gotta ask if many of the criticisms are even valid or do they make sense, because I'm actually one of the few people who love Avatar. I think it's still a pretty good movie even after all these years. Sure, it's not a masterpiece, even though I gave this movie a 5-star rating on Letterboxd, but then again, who takes Letterboxd seriously anymore? Avatar does have its flaws, and even I have my own criticisms on this film, but honestly, I don't think it really warrants the hate this movie gets. So I'm gonna tackle some of the criticisms that this film gets. The first big criticism I like to tackle involves the characters. A lot of people criticize the film for having completely bland and forgettable characters to the point where they can't even remember their names. To be honest, I can't exactly say that this is a bad critique, because if you're not invested in a story and you haven't seen the movie in a long time, then chances are, of course, you're not going to remember the characters. But if you recently watched the film and you're not even going to bother to get invested or at least learn their names, then that seems more of a you problem than a problem of the film itself. In the movie, there are plenty of characters that I can at least recall their names for, like Jake Sully, Neytiri, this funny guy named Tesute, Grace, played by Sigourney Weaver, and of course the main villain Quaritch. I don't think these names are particularly hard to forget, and if you're just not paying attention to the movie, then of course you're not going to remember the names of the characters. The point of a movie is to get invested, to actually pay attention to it. A lot of the times when people say they can't remember the names of the characters, it turns out they haven't seen the film in quite a while, or they just didn't pay attention to it at all. And you know they didn't pay attention to the movie when they completely gloss over key plot points. The characters themselves aren't even badly written if you ask me. Yeah, the characters are simple, they mostly fill in an archetype, but simple doesn't mean bad. Jake Sully as a main character is particularly intriguing. Jake Sully goes from this rather depressed dumb grunt to actually developing a personality and coming to falling in love with the planet of Pandora and actually caring about the Na'vi and the wildlife there. Is his character arc cliche and simple? Yes, but that doesn't make it bad. It just means that he's expertly written for what the story is supposed to be about. Another character that I think is well written is the character of Grace, played by Sigourney Weaver. She's a scientist who studies Pandora and its wildlife and understands the Na'vi better than any of the other human characters. But despite all of her knowledge, she doesn't really truly understand the Na'vi. You see, for all of her attempts to understand the Na'vi, what's holding her back is that she sees everything through a scientific lens. She tries to rationalize all of the mysticism and the religious aspects of Pandora, but what she doesn't realize is the fact that all that religion, all of that mysticism, it's real. Eywa exists. She's an actual nature god on Pandora, and yet she doesn't believe Eywa exists. All she thinks is that there's some kind of scientific explanation for it all. And perhaps there is, but that's not the point. The point is, Mother Nature actually exists, and she doesn't realize this until well after she dies. It's kind of the reason why Jake Sully was kind of the chosen one, and not Grace, who understands the Na'vi more. It's because Jake Sully isn't a scientist. He is not the type of person who just tries to rationalize everything, and because his cup is half empty, he actually comes to understand what the Na'vi are all about. I mean, I think the movie pretty much explains this when you pay attention. There's a scene in the movie where Moad, the shaman of the Na'vi, explains to Jake Sully that they tried to teach the Sky people their ways, but they really couldn't teach them because they're scientists. They're researchers. They're not here to learn about some religious mumbo-jumbo. They're scientists who are there to rationalize everything. But because Jake Sully isn't a scientist, and he is in fact a warrior, his cup is half empty. That's why Jake Sully is the chosen one, and why Grace really didn't learn how the Na'vi worked until she saw AWOL for herself. This story has much deeper characters if you just pay attention to it. But okay, alright, not every character in Avatar is well fleshed out. Some characters are there just to serve the story, and you have a point there, but again, that doesn't mean that the story is bad. Every fictional story has a character where they're just there to serve the story, rather than have a defining character arc. I mean, let's take an example from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, one of the biggest movie franchises ever. Does anybody remember this character from Age of Ultron? I mean, you should, she helps create Vision. Oh wait, not many people remember her. I guess Age of Ultron just sucks because there's a character that's only there to serve the story instead of having a defining character arc. Well, what about Donkey from Shrek? What's his character arc? How does he grow and change? Oh, he doesn't. He actually stays the same throughout the entire movie. Or what about the mob bosses in The Dark Knight? They surely have to have some well-defined character arcs that really flesh them out and go through such character development, right? Listen, the point I'm trying to make here is that not every character in a story has to have a defining character arc that really fleshes them out. Sure, it's a bonus, but not every character has to do it. Only the main characters and the ones you actually focus on should be the ones to have a character arc. Okay then, but what about Quaritch? I mean, he's just a generic bad guy who does bad guy things because he's the bad guy. Well, I guess you do have a point there, since Quaritch is the main villain, and yet he doesn't really have all that much development towards him. And yet, people still remember him because he's a generic bad villain. Again, being simple doesn't mean bad. In fact, Quaritch is pretty much a fan favorite because he's such a generic, bland villain that people remember him because he's such a douchebag. I then have to ask my fellow critics, what exactly are they trying to criticize here? Because I hear people criticizing the villain for being forgettable, and yet at the same time, people remember what this character is supposed to be, and then they try to backpedal and say, oh, but the character is just generic. That seems questionable if you have to criticize something, but then you immediately contradict yourself and you have to backtrack and then criticize something else. That's interesting. But at the end of the day, everybody else is entitled to their opinions. Listen, I'm not saying that you can't hate these characters. If you don't like these characters and you can't remember their names, that's fine. More power to you. All I'm trying to do is point out that most of the criticisms against these characters are rather invalid. You can have an opinion on something, but if your opinion has terrible points, then I'm pretty sure people have the right to call you out on it. But it's not just the characters that people are criticizing. The second thing I want to tackle is the story. Oh my god, Avatar is just Ferngully in space. It's just dances with wolves. It has such a generic plot. It's bad. Again, having a simple plot doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, a lot of stories, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, have simple plots of superheroes gaining superpowers, and then trying to go on a hero's journey, and then saving the day. I'm surprised people don't criticize superhero movies for having the same basic formula. I mean, She-Hulk criticized it, but nobody takes She-Hulk seriously. We don't talk about She-Hulk. The point is, yes, it's true that stories do have typical story beats, formulas, and cliches, and tropes, and etc., but that doesn't make the story bad. It's how it presents itself that counts. Avatar isn't the same as Dances with Wolves and Ferngully in terms of plot. Yes, they are similar concepts, and they are going to have some of the same tropes. But just because that doesn't mean that they are similar. They still have different plot beats. And I can thank James Rolfe, the angry video game nerd, for pointing this out. Again, you can dislike Avatar for having a much more simple story and rather cliche environmental message. I get it. It's not a bad critique, but to call the movie bad because it's trying to tell this particular story just seems a little biased if you ask me. Because if you're going to criticize Avatar for being a bland and generic story that's nothing but just dances with the wolves in space, why aren't we criticizing Star Wars? Star Wars has a rather simple story that's already been told to death, and yet it's one of the most iconic films of all time. Why doesn't Star Wars get the type of criticism that Avatar gets? Or what about Raiders of the Lost Ark? I mean, yeah, it's a typical adventure film, so everybody likes adventure films, but it's already a story that's been told to death, and yet Raiders of the Lost Ark is a classic film. Or what about Alien? Alien has a horror story that's been done to death, and yet it's still one of the most iconic films of all time. Why is Avatar the only movie that I've seen people criticizing it for being Dances with the Wolves in space when every other iconic film has a plot that's already been told in another medium? I mean, sure, you could say it's all about execution, but if we were talking about execution, then I already pointed out that Avatar has a different execution than Ferngully or Dances with Wolves. It seems to me people are just being very biased against Avatar. And then I gotta ask the question, why are people being biased against Avatar in the first place? Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that Avatar is the highest grossing film. I'm not the first to point this out, but it really does say something when people are putting such high expectations and a lot of pressure on this film because it's the highest grossing film of all time. Because if you have that kind of title, then surely you're the best movie ever made, right? Honestly, people, you need to lower your expectations. Just because the movie made a ton of money does not reflect the quality of the film itself. Yeah, it made a ton of money, but that doesn't mean that's the best movie ever made. Otherwise, we'd be praising the Transformers movies. I mean, they made a ton of money too, so... Yeah, I don't think Avatar is overrated, more or less that it's overhyped, because there are still some good qualities to the film that if you just pay attention to the movie, you'd see. But at the same time, I guess people are expecting a lot more because it's the highest grossing film of all time, so therefore they're probably expecting something like The Godfather, which, I mean, The Godfather is a good movie and all, but that's not what you're gonna get for Avatar. Avatar is a movie about blue monkeys fighting against the evil bad guys and stuff. So it's not that deep of a story. I mean, it does have much more deeper themes if you look into it, but it's not going to be the type of story that's like The Godfather or Kill Bill or Avengers Endgame or any other of those better films. Because Avatar knows the story that it's trying to tell, and it tells that story pretty well, at least in my opinion, but if you're going to criticize the movie for trying to tell a certain story, then of course you're not going to like the movie. And again, I'm not trying to invalidate anybody's feelings here. If you still don't like Avatar, then that's your opinion. That's valid. You have your own feelings. But I'm just saying that a lot of the criticism towards Avatar just seem wrong to me. They're just invalid. It almost comes across as if people didn't watch this movie, which, if you haven't seen the movie in a long time, then of course you haven't seen the film. Although, I do realize such a contradiction now that I think about it. People criticize Avatar for being forgettable, yet they compare it to Dances with Wolves, which means they understand at least what the plot is basically about, so... that's interesting. Overall, this is my defense for Avatar. I don't think Avatar is a bad movie. I think it does have at least some decent qualities to it that, if you really look for it, it's a pretty decent film. I'm not sure if I changed anybody's mind by making this video. I'm sure that there are still going to be people who don't like Avatar, and you know what? That's fine. I'm mainly making this video because I feel like most of the criticisms are just not that valid to me, and I want to call them out. And that's basically all I have to say. This was my defense for the movie Avatar. Thank you guys for watching, and if you like this video, then I'll see you next time. Peace out. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, as well as hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell for more content like this. If you want to go support me on Patreon, links will be provided in the description below, as well as links to my Instagram and DeviantArt pages for bonus content.